deep in the bowels of the mothership, we have recently uncovered a series of ancient tapes containing conversations on game design which we are declassifying and sharing with the public for the first time. This is the Barash Files. Wee woo, pretty spooky stuff.
All right, well, blah, 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 blah. Welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio, The Barash Files. My name is Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Uncomfortable taking a compliment, Maddox?
I appreciate the criticism. Honestly, I can take that really well.
I don't actually think you're that uncomfortable taking a compliment, but I needed a nickname that would tie in with the other nickname I'm about to give, which is Zach Complimentee Barash.
Thank you.
You're very complimentary is the thing about you. And I think both Anthony and I are like not used to complimentary friends.
What does that say about our relationship?
It says you've known each other for a long time.
Yeah, and all of our other friends too. Yep.
I don't know, like I'm analytical. My mind can't not sort of analyze the world around me. And I found it makes me happy to just like point out things about other people that I admire. And also I think it makes life easier to navigate. It makes me be a more positive person. Also, I should probably introduce myself. Hello, my name is Zach Barash. I work for Wizards of the Coast. These are my own and not my employers' opinions.
Yeah, Wizards of the Coast is definitely not complimentary of us. On this episode of Lucky Paper Radio, we're joined once again by Zach Barash. This is the third in our series of the Barash Files. Check out the previous two episodes if you want full continuity. But this episode, you are going to be basically telling the tales of the times you've drafted Anthony and my cubes, which, if it were anyone else in that seat, I would say, oh, we're about to get roasted. You know, let's talk about all the problems you had and what we could learn from those mistakes that we made in our cube design. But I suspect you're going to be very complimentary.
Wait, this is just Zach tales? You don't have any tales?
Am I supposed to have tails too?
I thought so.
I would love if you have tails, although I've drafted more of your cubes than you've drafted of mine, which
That's
is not
true.
an indictment. One of my cubes has been sort of out of commission for a while. Two of them don't exist yet. The digital ones are their own thing. And UMA has only ever been at one event.
Yeah.
Andy, you were working that event, so you didn't get to play.
I played 2 of the 6 drafts at that event, yeah. And I played both cubes that I was going to do commentary on.
But what you're talking about of like, oh, I'm going to be complimenting them. I think that there's so much more joy to be had and more space in identifying what was fun and exciting and worked rather than so often, can I have feedback from my cube? These are all the cards that sat in my sideboard and they were not strong enough. Okay, these are the cards that you should add that they are stronger. Okay, you should add Fable the Mirror Breaker. Okay.
It's got synergies.
It has every synergy.
I'm so tired of that bit.
Okay, then don't draw attention to it. Let's just keep going.
Everybody's been saying that for a year. Anyway, first of all, I should say that I agree to some degree. I think complimentary feedback can be helpful. I enjoy critical feedback. So I would, for when you get to Tales of any of my cubes, if you have any criticism, I would gladly take it.
Sure. I mean, there are so many areas to jump in. Maybe the right spot to start with is Bun Magic.
Can I actually jump in and start with a small tale before we get deep into it?
Yeah.
And ask you a question that I've been wanting to ask you for a very, very long time.
Oh, this is exciting.
About a tale that does involve you. So you might remember from the podcast a long time ago, Andy talked to me about after Cube for a Cause. You came up to Andy and told him about how you watched me lose a game so profoundly that I could not lose in any way except by doing one thing, which was not attacking. And I'm just curious if you remember a little bit more about that game, because I've been so curious this whole time.
Oh, man. Okay. So this...
You make us uncomfortable with compliments, we make you uncomfortable by making you do a criticism.
So this came up the first time that I came to town, and it's a Bun Magic Cube story. We did a rotisserie draft of Bun Magic Cube. Does this sound correct so far?
We did do a rotisserie draft of Bun Magic.
But I think
Cube.
this story
did
is
come to
referring
town
to
to play the game. I'm so bad at timeline. I totally trust that's when this was from, but I couldn't tell you.
Well, this was at Cube for a Cause in one of the...
That's what he told me about.
We had this conversation.
It wasn't a draft he observed at Cube for a Cause.
That makes a little bit more sense, because I was definitely reflecting on those games and I was thinking, I don't remember that happening.
So Andy and I for about 2 years now, I think we've had conversations about playing competitively and improving as a player. This is a conversation that we had. I think the one video that I've been on with Lucky Paper was we did a draft together. And you asked me to sort of analyze your draft style, what I would have done differently.
Yeah, actually, I had done a draft, and you watched it
Yes,
back with
after the
me
fact.
and then gave me feedback on it.
And
Linked in the show notes.
this was a continuation of that conversation about improvement. Or I had a very successful run with this Bun Magic rotisserie draft. This was my second ever rotor draft ever. I drafted Control, which I'd been told was harder to draft, and I interpreted that as
Not
both...
by me, for the record, but by other people.
I interpreted that as both a challenge in that, like, I don't know, I like proving hypotheses. I love drafting Control in and of itself. And if people believe it's hard, there's a good chance they're not going to fight me for it, which is exactly what happened. So I remember most of my matches that happened in that draft because it was round robin. I got to play all but one person. And I remember the matchup that on paper I think was my worst was against Anthony. Anthony had an uncontested, I think, mono white aggro deck. And you had...
It's starting to come back.
And you had Esper Sentinel, you had Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, you had equipment spells, you had creature lands, you had a lot of cards that matched up very well against my deck, which is all Wraths. Also, if I get any of the details wrong, I'd say they were for engagement, but no one was even there to remember that. But this I'm just doing from memory for a year and a half ago. So
you can see video footage of both these decks, though not playing each other. Both playing my deck. If you want to watch me go, I believe 2-5 in my own roto draft. So you can check those videos out. I'll link those in the show notes too.
And I feel you've put me in an uncomfortable position because I don't like being...
That's what friends are here to do for each other on a podcast.
critical of the people around me, especially when they didn't invite that criticism. Andy and I have had this dialogue where Andy's been like, tell me things that I could do to improve myself.
I have invited this criticism just now.
You and I haven't had that conversation prior to this point, but I remember what happened in our matchup that took what I believed was the most challenging on paper matchup for me and made it less challenging in the sense that I had Wraths, and you know that I had Wraths. So you were conservative in your plays. That's a classic way to play around Wraths, but the challenge is this style of counterplay against a known adversary can be self-defeating in that sometimes the best thing that you can do is just jam your threats and hope they don't have the Wrath, make them have it, and if they don't have it, they just lose. Whereas if you only deploy 2 threats at a time, the Wrath will never hurt that badly, but you are giving me 2-3 more turns of a life buffer. You're taking it so that I can use Swords to Plowshares, Snapcaster Swords to Plowshares, or Spot Removal to just give myself a lot more time. Similarly, by giving me more time, Esper Sentinel and Thalia do less damage. And also by giving me more time, it makes it so that I can save my Spot Removal for your creature lands, which will survive my Wraths. So I remember under that matchup, I was under a lot less pressure early on than I expected to be. And the advice that I would have for somebody in in that situation is like, just jam, just make me have it, and prioritize the kinds of cards like Thalia that are going to make a turn 4 Wrath impossible. But it definitely was it more came out as I'm criticizing Anthony behind his back, which obviously is my MO and makes me feel really comfortable and happy.
Well, I was going to say, thank you for this much more detailed insight into that matchup. Like, that's very valuable because, like, you're a much more experienced player than me, and I would not have thought through it that way. The much more reduced feedback that I got through Andy, which was just, I did not attack, therefore I lose. I wanted to just say thank you for that as well, because this was something that Andy had passed on to me, and then it just sort of stuck in my brain. And, you know, I've had a pretty good year just playing a lot better, winning a lot more.
I mean, just in the past 3 months, I feel like your record has been astounding.
I've been winning a lot of Magic, and
I've seen your
literally
CubeCon trophy pins.
At CubeCon, I had this little voice in my head that every single combat, if I was not attacking, I had to explain to myself, why am I not attacking here? And I think that was a big part of my success. So, thank you for the gift of
criticism.
Advice.
Criticism is so valuable.
Well, this underlies a baseline assumption that a lot of people have of like, I want to be winning, because winning is inherently fun.
I saw the big smile on his face at CubeCon. He was having a great time.
Yeah.
Smiling, shaking, panicked.
But there is that question of like, how much do you want to win? And like, at what level does winning stop meaning for you? And I really respect you for, at CubeCon, despite you were in like the top 10 ranked players going into the cut, you made the determination of like, I want to have dinner more than I want to play another draft today.
Yeah, and we've talked about how I'm less interested in win rate at the end than that feeling of satisfaction of self-improvement, and I definitely had achieved that day, where it's like I had specific matches, which maybe we can go into in story time, but where it's like, oh, I'm not just going on heuristics and playing the cards to sequence my own deck the best way. Like, I really felt like I was playing against my opponent more, and that was a really satisfying moment that I feel like, I mean, it's hard to say is more valuable than the trophy pins, but let's say equal.
Well, I'm happy in the future to provide more direct feedback when asked for it.
Well, I think maybe
But I will also be very circumspect when talking to Andy about anybody else.
You know, I'm sorry if me sharing that was not appropriate. I would never do it to somebody that I know would take it badly or wasn't 100% confident would, take it in the light in which it was intended. But regardless, I apologize. Shouldn't have shared that without your permission.
We're all good, and you're on notice.
I think to the point you're getting at, though, like, Anthony, you've been pretty clear in talking on the podcast, and I'm sure talking with the friends, that, like, you don't care to just get better at the game per se. Like, just, like, that's not your value. And if Zach said, hey, you know how you can get better at this? You could go and grind Arena and play, this matchup for 12 matches every, weekend night for a while. Yeah, that'd make you better. But that you're not interested in. But if someone can say, hey, I've observed this pattern, and this little tidbit I can give you and communicate in 30 seconds will actually help recontextualize how you look at every future game going forward, that's a very small amount of effort for a potentially big reward. And
it's still like gaining insight, which is much more fun than like grinding to build up muscle memory and like learn about nuances of card interactions that maybe would be just not as rewarding.
And that's part of what's great about being in a community, of you have other people who can cover each other's bases, who can see you from the outside and reflect back to you who you are, things that you might not be able to see from yourself because the mirror in front of you just reflects a reverse distorted version of you, and they can see things about you you can't.
Yeah, we all have holes.
That's true.
We all have holes as a player, right? And I think, for a long time you've said in yourself, you're like, I just don't want my guys to die.
Yeah.
In
so many of those matches, like specifically thinking about CubeCon, it's like, oh yeah, I can definitely see how I would look at this board state and say, if I keep my 2/2 alive, I'll like draw a card with it 2 turns from now. But my opponent's 2/2 also does stuff, and so often it's like, all right, attack all. Like, I know this is reasonable, even though I feel like I'm losing some equity down the line. And so often people reasonably don't block, and it's like, hey, there goes your life total. This is great.
That's gotta be so satisfying to have been able to like see that difference so directly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm jealous, honestly.
Those moments are rare.
It seems really, really rewarding.
The first ever article that I wrote for Hipsters back in 2013 was entitled Level Up Moments, and it was about that, of especially when you start playing Magic, because at the time I had designed the Learn to Play curriculum at my local game store, and I was teaching a lot of people, and I just watched them learn moment after moment after moment within the span of an hour, and then over the course of days. And I was a few years back to the game after a long absence, and had started playing competitively, and my level up moments were fewer and farther between. Frankly, I think the last time that I had a moment of searing insight as a competitive player was at a Grand Prix in 2016. And since then, my life has changed quite a bit.
It's also just the way it goes. I mean, the more you get, like, it's always going to be that you get this like rush of immediate, obvious growth when you start something new, and then it takes long times before you can actually see any of those milestones once you're really invested.
Yeah. And earlier on, there's just so much more to learn. You have that transition from understanding the basics of the game to understanding the basics of combat, getting into strategy. There's the intermediate moment when you realize your opponent might have a combat trick and you want to play around it, to the advanced moment you realize, I'm going to make him have it.
Yep.
And you go back to playing the way that you were at a beginner, but
which is why the heuristics exist.
Yep.
but with an intention that also you then can realize when there are exceptions to that. So you do in a way go back to how you played at the beginning, but 90% of the time rather than 100% of the time.
Right. Yep. And you are able to suss out and intuit things that you weren't able to see. I'm generally pretty good at understanding, especially if I know a list, exactly what cards are in my opponent's hand just based on the way that they're playing, which we were talking about poker
Spooky.
a little bit before this, of like, you can't do something 100% of the time in the same way, because then you're creating tells for yourself. But if you do an 80-20, most of the time I'll do it, but not always, you can make yourself much, much harder to read.
There was such a great moment last night. I'm not sure if either of you heard this in the draft, where Sarah and Julian, whom are married and are both very skilled Magic players. And I think Sarah has learned the game a lot through Julian, who's been a really good Magic player for a very long time. And Sarah is now extremely accomplished and skilled herself. But Sarah played a Horizon land on turn 1. And Julian out loud goes, you wouldn't keep a 1-land hand, but why else would you play a Horizon land on turn 1? You must have an Ash Barrens in your hand. And she was like, fucking God damn it. I hate how stupid and smart you are. It's so frustrating. You're so smart. I hate this so much. And she cycles her Ash Barrens. It's just very funny to me.
That's very cool.
Yeah. Like, that's one of the many beautiful levels of the game. You start playing it on a higher level and you get to have those kinds of self-satisfying moments.
Julian's like, this doesn't help me. Like,
Yeah.
That doesn't matter that I know.
And like maybe once in a blue moon, that'll be like, oh, I'm going to change my sequencing a little bit because I know mana disruption is going to matter a little bit more. Or I need to get a little bit more aggressive because you're going to potentially miss a land drop.
Or I'll keep a Stifle in my hand.
Yeah.
Does Stifle work on cycling? I think it does.
It does, yeah.
Cool.
But you don't have any staples in the regular cube.
No way.
Absolutely not.
I talked about level up moments, and I said as a competitive player, I think my last one was quite some time ago. But as a cube designer, I'm still having those. Over the past year, I played 100 Ornithopters for the first time. I played a regular for the first time. I've started designing some weird experimental cubes that I've never seen the likes of, and I'm asking questions that I don't know the answers to. And similarly, I picked up UMA Plus, which I made for CubeCon 2 years ago, and haven't really touched since. And I'm like, oh, I would make so many choices differently.
Yeah.
I've actually learned a lot, and I had that artifact of me 2 years ago to chart my growth, which felt good.
I took a big break on just actively editing the Bun Magic Cube just because I was really enthralled, both with Neoclassical and 100 Ornithopters, kind of back-to-back and a little bit concurrently. And just all of my design focus was kind of tied up in these other two projects. And I can't tell you how much of a breath of fresh air it was to then go back and look at Bun Magic Cube after having not really looked at it with any kind of intention for maybe the better part of a year, and just being like, oh, there's so many cards I'm so happy to cut. This is great. Like, I have more room in this cube now because there are so many things I can see now with the benefit of hindsight, and distance actually are easy cuts for me.
It gets a lot easier to disassociate yourself with your pet cards or recommit yourself to it. That's what happened to me. My main cube I built in 2013, and I haven't played it that much for many, many years because I've had a wealth of cubes to choose from, and it sort of was playing similarly in the regular cube space of like, it's not as strong as my friend's cubes. Still a very different power level, and I went to break it up last month. And then I saw those cards in it, and I fell in love with it again. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to redesign this cube based on what I know now, chasing with much more specific goals, chasing specific kinds of play and design aesthetics. And I wouldn't have been able to do that 5 years ago. And on that bombshell, I don't know, want to pick a cube?
How about you pick a cube? I mean, we talk about the cubes all the time. I'm curious to hear what you got to say.
I just brought up regular cube. So let's talk about that. And I feel like I have a shorter story about that.
Can I I want to do this for new listeners. I just want to indulge people in a basic description of the regular cube, just so we aren't being totally obtuse here. The regular cube is Anthony's primary cube, the one you've been curating for probably 5-6 years now at this point. And it is a lower power level cube relative to other Eternal cubes that play a lot of iconic cards from Magic's constructed history, and instead plays what you described closer as to a Master's power level set, but I think Zach is going to argue that it's actually closer to a modern retail power level, specifically Foundations, and features a lot of like fair magic. It's a lot of overlapping sort of micro synergies, creature combat matters, basic removal matters, and there's not a lot of like snowballing unfair things happening.
Lots of bears with a little bit of upside and very low curving.
I think it's got a high level of approachability. It's working pretty hard to not be overly complicated, either in comprehending the cards or in the board states that it creates. I think it has fairly, small-sized creatures, which has an interesting textural element to how removal functions. It's not overly prescriptive about card synergies, and the dynamic that it results in is something that in many ways looks like a rarity-restricted cube, but isn't. It's just curating the kinds of cards you'll often see in those experiences. So I first met you guys at CubeCon 2022. First CubeCon, we were all future designers. I was very excited about the Turbo Cube, and I had started listening to Lucky Paper that summer.
And your hotel was on the way to the venue from our house, so we decided to pick you up every day and give you a ride because you posted somewhere about that.
It was very sweet and very kind of you that I got to ride the Lucky Paper bus. Yeah, I'd started listening to Lucky Paper that summer. It was the summer that I got married. We basically went into hibernation lockdown because so many people we knew were sick, and we didn't want that, which is when I started listening to the podcast. And I remember hearing all these conversations that you had about Oketra's Monument and White Maned Lion, which were Anthony's pet cards. And there was a question of like, do we cut them? Do we keep them? Spoilers, this is not a story of like, I think, a deep learning about Cube. This is a story about just a really good experience.
We're telling stories here.
I remember I drafted, my theory about the Cube, which remains to this day, is I think a blue-white base control deck is one of the best things you can do. Just because there are a couple Wraths in the Cube. They are the best sources of card advantage. There are a lot of things that don't break board stalls. And I did it. I got to do exactly that deck, and I played against the, on paper, I think, best deck at the time, a black-red sacrifice deck headlined by Mayhem Devil and a very competent pilot. And I think we're in the last game. I had a plan for that game, and Anthony comes over. We've only just met, like, the 2 days before. And asks me, what's under that shell duck aisle? And I'm like, just stay here for a little bit. And my opponent was very gracious as I got to just style. Played on Oketra's Monument, and end of turn, White Maned Lion came out from under the shell duck aisle, did the full combo that Anthony was excited about, made, I think, like 6 warriors, and then untapped and made 8 more, and won. And that was just a gift of an experience that Anthony gave me of, there was this thing that he cared about, that there was disagreement about whether it was going to be good enough. And I'm glad I got to share with him the experience of somebody else having fun with the thing that he was very excited about. Did I learn something deep about cube design? I don't know. But there is that value of that rare bingo or Yahtzee moment that it's not going to happen that often, but when it does happen, it is cool, and also it does the good thing that combos do. It ends the game immediately.
It was pretty delightful. I mean, to not only see you do that, but just like have it sitting there secretly in play the whole time and be like, now it's time to reveal. Yeah, I have since cut Oketra's Monument because that was the most combo-y thing in the environment, and it doesn't go infinite, it just goes big enough to usually end the game, but also it can really draw the game out. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the thing about cubes is they are living, and I've taken that out because we'd seen it enough, but I'm really glad to have seen it in this really high-profile, exciting way.
Yeah, there's something nice about the exclamation mark to cap off an experience and say, it's ready for my cube to rotate this, at least for the moment. And that's also a truism of game design. You can always go back. You'll always have another project. Something was beautiful once, and you can let it go to the sunset or go to another cube, and you can always bring it back. But I don't know. That's a shorter story. I feel like
I remember those conversations about Oketra's Monument. We had a lot back then. And I think there was some conversation of power level, but I do remember it mostly being about, this is a different kind of thing. And it's like, if you don't get to do the combo, is Oketra's Monument just way below the power level of the cube? Or is White Maned Lion way below the power level of the cube? Because your opponent can just respond to you casting it by removing your only other creature, and now you just put it right back in your hand and you get to do nothing. And I agree it was the kind of thing where it was like, to me, that's like a chapter. That's like a season of the regular cube was the Oketra's Monument season. And we're in a new season now, but it's nice that it had that time.
Yeah, I mean, to punctuate that season was a match that you and I, Andy, played where I had the combo, and it was only making, I think it was actually, I had a different creature that cost 3, so I was making 2 or 3 soldiers every turn. Enough that you were not able to push through, but I was also not winning that game quickly, and it was just like, okay, this is a different tempo and like texture of game than what we're expecting here, so goodbye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost funny you say that it ends the game quickly. That was my, I think, chief complaint about the card combination in the regular cube at the time is that my experience primarily is that it didn't. It was like, it gives you infinite chump blockers for a very reasonable rate, but oftentimes the deck that is able to pull that combo off is not necessarily in a position to turn the corner super decisively. But that's a difference of pilot or context or whatever.
Yeah, and there's an inherent challenge of the kind of cards like that can stall out the game. I don't know. You played me a bunch. I play a lot of control. I love playing control. I try to minimize the amount of misery that I induce in my opponent once I turn the corner.
Yeah.
I try and play fast, and I try and be like, all right, cool. I did the thing. I got to be the underdog. Now we can just end this.
I actually got similar feedback this week about the Bun Magic Cube from Julian about Retrofitter Foundry, who was just like playing a dedicated blue-white control deck. One of his main win conditions was Retrofitter Foundry, and he won his second match decisively, very quickly, just with the turn one Retrofitter Foundry both games. And then one game his opponent interaction, he just countered, and the other game his like fair creature deck opponent just had no way to go over or around or through Retrofitter Foundry. And Julian was just like, this card's amazing. I don't know if it belongs here because it just solely like negates so many of the cards my opponent would play. And that's what I felt playing against Odokedra's Monument combo in that game. I was like, well, I have a bunch of good creatures, but if they don't have flying or trample, they're just going to get negated indefinitely by the existence of Stonecloaker Okedra's Monument. And that's what Julian feels about Retrofitter Foundry and the Bun Magic Cube, which, I mean, could be a similar thing.
But you also love that card, so I feel like that's a hard sell.
Yeah, I mean, it's not coming out of the cube, I'll tell you right now. Like, it's I think, a power outlier there, and it's one that I explicitly chose because of it doing completely unique things that really no other Magic card in all of Magic's history allows you to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to love about the card. It lets you spend as much mana as you have access to. It's a win condition in of itself. It's relatively slow. It's a card type that's hard to interact with. You can get badly punished if you over-rely on it and your opponent does have the interaction. It does feel a little anti-Bun Magic to me in that it will lead to these kinds of prolonged game states where one person is slowly pulling ahead over time. And it also has a bunch of unique little bits of texture to it of like, oh, if I have an actual Ornithopter, it just becomes a 4/4 immediately.
Have you ever considered putting this in the Ornithopter cube?
It makes non-Ornithopter tokens is the problem. Yeah, it's funny. I get comments like that a lot from people that are like, well, this card seems so anti-Bun Magic. And so often my response is like, in order for the things that I want to matter, they need something to play against. Like, if every single... Like, I've played cubes that are, like, all 2 drops or less, right? And then there, it actually doesn't become about that anymore because it becomes about this new meta thing of, like, well, everybody only has 2 drops, so the only thing that actually matters is grindy card advantage, even though you'd think everyone wants to be aggressive. So, I do have plenty of cards that I think are antithetical in some sense to the overarching thrust of what that cube is meant to be. They're just the cards that I adore so much that those are the ones I want to play that other role, right? Like, I do have some Planeswalkers in there that just uptick and gain value over time. I do have, cards that produce a bunch of tokens to clog up a board. Like, it is possible, but that's what makes the other thing, I think, shine, because you need that contrast in order for it to make sense.
Why don't we jump into talking about the Bun Magic Cube, especially because I feel like the most salient thing that I have to say about it is less a story, and it's more about what the cube itself is.
Okay, sure. Take it away.
My perception of Bun Magic is it is your aesthetic, Andy, personified. It is your style of gameplay maximized to perhaps the most that you can in a single coherent environment.
I think that's definitely my goal, so that's good to hear.
And I have different aesthetics from you. I quite enjoy playing the cube. I quite enjoy getting to dive into what you value. I have enjoyed applying my aesthetics within that environment and trying to force different types of gameplay, wring it from something that isn't designed for that but has the components for it. Of like, control is a little bit harder to do in a cube that I would say is about attrition-focused, often tempo-y mid-range gameplay. And you can disagree with that moniker, and we can discuss that.
We would just be disagreeing about terms, I believe.
Yes, and that was last episode. I love that you have so coherent an aesthetic that you can condense it down into a cube. And because you have done that, you can very intentionally explore other aesthetics in other environments.
Boy, that is so important. I literally just made a somewhat sweeping set of changes to the Bun Magic Cube this morning, or last night actually. And the reason is solely because I now have this other cube project, my Sacred Geometry Cube, that is just unlocking a little bit of space where it's like, well, now this card was kind of in the Bun Magic Cube because it sort of fit, but I really wanted somewhere to play it. And now that I have a place that it fits even better, that space is freed up in the Bun Magic Cube to be something else. And that, as a cube designer, for me at least, I mean, this is not advice that's useful for most people. Most people don't have any cubes, and some people have one. It's rare that you have more than one. But for me, I remember having this exact same moment with the Degenerate Microcube, because the Bun Magic Cube actually used to have a lot more unfair combo stuff in it. Like, it used to do some things that are more emblematic of the, like, Magic Online Vintage Cube with, like, big artifact mana and upheaval and stuff like that. And once I had a place to do that stuff, and still have that kind of gameplay, I was able to more freely refine what the Bud Magic Cube was about and say, actually, you know what? All that stuff belongs over here in Degenerate Town, and now this can be more focused on Fair Magic. And similarly, I've felt this tension over the past few years as cards have gotten more complicated and Magic has just grown, that I want Bud Magic to be a expression of some of the extremities of Magic. I want you to be able to draft some of the hardest control decks in the Bud Magic Cube, where you have like 2 win conditions and you are just draw go control. I want you to be able to draft some extremely committed all-in aggressive decks that don't curve above 2. I want you to be able to do some of these extreme things, and I want to be playing the cards that are iconic and recognizable from constructed formats that are good at those roles. But I also have felt this like complexity creep and had complicated feelings about it. And being able to say, all right, well, let's have a space that's dedicated to playing the kind of Magic I enjoy, and also one of the primary goals is avoiding this kind of complexity creep, is going to let me feel a little more okay about having a little more of that in Bud Magic Cube, because I now have a place where that is specifically the goal.
Well, you're a game designer. You enjoy the craft of things, and you are designing things in order to give yourself permission to make certain kinds of cuts and additions.
What's the thing is, like, part of me is a game designer, a cube designer that is trying to make a cohesive experience and make something that is expressing a coherent idea from beginning to end. And part of me is a guy that wants to play with Ironcrag Pyromancer. And those things are at odds oftentimes, right? Like, oftentimes, like, I really want to play this card sometimes. I have my own cube design. I'm going to put it in my cube design so I get to cast it sometimes or draft it, which oftentimes is working against my stated goals of the project, because it's not actually telling that cohesive story. It just is meeting another goal that's separate. And so the more I give myself outlets to, as a player, get to like have cubes that capture certain experiences, the more each of them can be more cohesive.
Mm-hmm. That is a great bit of self-knowledge. I think for the average person who you're talking about who has at most 1 cube, I would encourage them to give themselves permission that they can always play that card somewhere else. They can always leave that card in their maybe board as much as they like, or keep it in the deck box and put it in, again, as we talked about last episode, today's the day I break out the Cogwork Librarians. Today's the day I shuffle in my 30 pet cards, and we're going to see what happens with them. I love that you create entire projects that help enable you to refine all of your projects at the same time, and that help you better understand the kind of gameplay that you're going for. And it's really fun diving into somebody else's idea of like a perfect curated experience, even if you're going to swim against that tide, or just to experience what life is like as somebody else. So that's what I love about Bud Magic.
That's what Bud Magic loves about you.
Oh, thank you, Bud Magic. Shall we talk about Turbo Cube?
Oh, yeah. I love to talk about the Turbo Cube.
Hey, real quick, Anthony, what's a Turbo Cube?
The Turbo Cube is a totally normal cube where all spells and activated abilities cost 2 generic mana less. That's all. Everybody's drafting Storm.
And within those constraints, you're more or less playing the most powerful exciting cards, with some exclusions where ones are...
Yeah, there's some notable exclusions, but I'm definitely, not just putting in a bunch of 6-drops that now cost 4. Most of the spells end up costing 1 or sometimes 2, often 0 mana. There's a lot of, cantripping rituals that draw you cards and generate mana for free, and lots of, like, weird Storm decks, and players can just win on turn 1 out of nowhere with crazy combos, or there's like some pretty powerful disruption as well that people can just kind of shut you out of doing that crazy Storm stuff.
So Turbo Cube goes back even farther in time than the first CubeCon. When I was going to the first CubeCon, this is the number 1 cube that was on my horizon.
And it's a weird cube. It was a more notable weird cube. It was more of an exception at the time, and so it was a little bit like, is this even something they're going to allow at the event? Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was actually really cool to see the offerings at CubeCon this year and how diverse they were, because, going back 3 years, it was mostly, big air quotes, normal cubes, and it's so cool that there's such a variety now.
God, I was just so excited to play it. That cube has been foundational for me as a designer. Like, the idea for the Cascade Cube, which is my rules modified cube, wasn't directly inspired by Turbo Cube before I even played it. And then I went to CubeCon and I played it, and we will get back to that. But the thing that excites me the most about it is something I've talked about with you guys a lot. You've talked about on the podcast, this concept of radical recontextualization of a card is performing very, very differently in one environment than anybody who's played with the card before. The best example I can think of for Turbo Cube is Guild Globe from War of the Spark.
which just
so much better than Oko.
It just looks like a different card to me now. If I see that on a rare occasion somebody has a Ravnica-themed cube, and I see that, I'm just like, ooh, kill.
I also have to stifle that like immediate basal response of like my reptile brain is like, it's incredible, take it. Then I'm like, no, stop. It's not incredible. It's pretty bad.
I have that exact same impression both with Turbo Cube cards and Cascade Cube cards. Mm-hmm. Where like, I don't know, I'll see a Conjurer's Bauble or a Field Mist border post and I'm like, oh wait, this isn't Cascade Cube.
Right, yep.
And God, I love how that cube or any recontextualization cube has a group of players open a pack of Magic cards, even if they know every single card, and they have to reread every single one to understand what's going on. How cards that are obviously strong to them are not going to fulfill that role, or they will, but everything else is so turbocharged, patent pending, that like it doesn't matter that the card is strong. Everything else is a 15 out of 10, even if that card is a 10 out of 10.
That's absolutely true. I mean, it's so easy to open up that pack. And that is one of my favorite moments is when somebody opens up a pack for the first time and reads all the cards and is like, wait, this is busted. Wait, this is busted. And they read something that's like, okay, this is just 1 mana for a 3/3 with haste that when it attacks, it generates a token. Like, this is insane. And then they put that in their deck.
The Mirror Superior experience.
Or the Mirror Superior, a 0 mana 4/5, and they cast that turn 1 and then pass the turn, and their opponent says, okay, I'm going to slowly draw my entire deck and then laser you with Aetherflux Reservoir. and people are like, oh yeah, so this was powered up to 15, and your deck is powered up to 100. Okay.
Yep. And I learned a lot from playing the cube. We played it on sort of the day half. It wasn't something that mattered for the main event. And my draft didn't go that well. I ended up with some fast mana, but I did not have the ability to do a turn 1 kill. I had what felt like a control deck in the format, which means I couldn't really start winning the game until turn 3. And I found the Turbo Cube absolutely a blast and absolutely overwhelming. And that ended up feeding back into the design of the Cascade Cube. And this took a second piece of inspiration of the Reading Rainbow Cube, also a Baltimore Cube. Beautiful cube. Every card is multicolored, and every player starts with a Pillar of the Perunes in play, which is this elegant solution to the design problem of, I want to make an all gold format. How much fixing do I need to include? What if I just do this one modification, and then suddenly it yields this entirely new recontextualization dynamic, where you just get to erase the color from 1 pip of the mana cost of every single card. And then you end up with the second order problem of, how can I set my deck up to double spell? When do I start committing to a color in the middle of the draft when I can be 5 picks and 5 colors in, and I don't know if I'm mono white, red, blue, black, or green?
And how do I build my mana base once I have picked all my cards? Because even if I picked, all cards that I can splash all the non-blue pips, am I still supposed to put some basics of the second most popular color among those picks in my deck anyway? Mm-hmm. Who's to say? It's impossible to know. I want to say one more thing about that rules modification, which I think people often overlook, which is also a subtle stroke of brilliance, I think, which is that all the cards are gold cards, not hybrid. Mm-hmm. Daniel does not count hybrid cards as gold cards, which also means there are no 1-drops. And so what's the point of turn 1 if people are just going to play a land and pass? Just start with the land and play. That means you just jump right to turn 2, which is the turn that the game would start anyway, which is another way that, again, very subtle thing, resonates with multiple aspects of that cube's design.
And I can't talk about Turbo Cube without talking about Reading Rainbow and Cascade Cube, because this is one story
kissing
in my mind. Yeah. Well, they're all clown shoes cues that are in dialogue with each other. And I looked at the Turbo Cube, and I absolutely love how it just supercharges all of these cards that you get people giddy about, cards that people forgot about, of like, wait, it's just an egg. It's one of the original eggs. Oh, but it's, what is it, Sky Cloud Egg? Of like, oh, it's 0 mana, tap, sack it, add white, blue, and draw a card? That's insane. That's better than Black Lotus.
And hopefully you already have something in play that says whenever you cast an artifact, do blank and make some sharks.
And the challenge inherent in Turbo Cube, and what I think makes it, the two things that I think make it a often exhausting play experience, which hopefully doesn't come across poorly.
No, it is. I mean, it's not the kind of thing you want to do every day. It's a sometimes treat when you have the stamina for this kind of intense thing.
And the two challenges of it are, first, so many decks just win or lose the game on turn 1. And oftentimes being on the play or being on the draw is the primary determinant of who wins or who loses. The secondary thing, and this is where I look to the brilliance of Reading Rainbow, Turbo Cube's emblem involves a translation that applies to every single card at least once and possibly twice. Of the mana cost that's printed in the top right corner of the card is in almost all cases inaccurate, and the text box is generally inaccurate. That therein lies the joy of the environment. So much of the fun is you get to read the card and be like, oh, but at the same time, you're doing it for every card, and it can be exhausting. Reading Rainbow just gives players a magic card, and the magic card unlocks all of these dynamics. But at the end of the day, Magic players know how to play with Magic cards. Cube players know how to play with Magic cards. And just by giving them one for free that only does what's printed on it and there's no additional translation, there's just sort of second order revelations, it makes for, in my mind, a smoother play experience. And that's why with the Cascade Cube, I was like, I'm not going to try a lot of different modifications, and I'm not going to do anything that requires mental translation. I want every card to work the way that it does, and I want my emblem to be a card that exists in Magic. And then I made it, and it was super duper card and super duper exhausting.
Super card.
And I've spent months and months refining it because I made it for CubeCon 2023 of like, how do I make this a more pleasant, less exhausting experience? How do I make this what I thought might be a like silly, wacky fun times cube, and it is actually the spikiest thing I have ever made and ever will make.
It's interesting how Cascade always turns out to be that, isn't it?
There's a really interesting tension there because obviously if you listen to this show, you know how much I care about keeping things accessible and simple and understandable to people. But also, part of the appeal of these cubes is that they are explicitly something totally different, which is going to inherently be inaccessible. And I think it would be a mistake to smooth off those experiences enough that you lose the clown shoes-ness. Like, drafting the Turbo Cube is always going to be intense, and I think it should be. And if it wasn't, then you've somehow lost a core part of the essence of the Turbo Cube.
Yeah, I love all three of these cubes that we're talking about right now, and yes, one of them I made. I think for the vast, vast, vast majority of cube players, they would be terrible choices for your first, second, or third try at a cube. They're just hard, and the weirdness is, as Andy said, integral to the fun. If you haven't seen something else, you're not going to appreciate all the weird stuff that's happening there.
You know, I would have said that so much a few years ago, and I've observed in our local play group, people walk up on their second ever cube draft, and we show them the cubes that are on offer that night, and we're like, hey, it's your second ever cube draft, maybe don't do the Turbo Cube. And I've watched people walk into it, do it, and have an incredible time. I think, honestly, some people just have a different mentality if they are, honestly, less spiky and just care less about the outcome and just are, like, down to have a good time. I think there's actually some people out there that it's totally fine. They're down to clown and do, like, a few weeks ago, multiple people did their first ever cube draft of the 100 Ornithopters cube. It was the first cube they'd ever drafted, and they had a great time. I wouldn't enjoy that because I'd be like, I'm learning like 4 new things all at once, and I'm embarrassed I'll be bad at some of them, and I want space to like learn them each in isolation so I can have opportunities to reflect on what I could do better or not. Some people are just happy to do a thing and don't necessarily care about any of that stuff. So I mean, I still give that advice, but I myself have learned that actually, if someone says they're down to draft the crazy cube, and they don't seem worried about it, I'll tell them, like, hey, here's the deal, here's what you're signing up for. But if they say they're down to do it, let them do it. They might just have a great time.
And that point is well taken. And frankly, that, I think, chips away at the concept of a clown shoes cube in general. Of maybe to the people who have a strong sense of this is what a cube is, these cubes are going to be more off-putting than somebody who's just sort of down for whatever and doesn't have as fully formed opinions. And I thank you for reminding me that I've had people who played the Cascade Cube as one of their first cube experiences. And by and large, the response has been like, oh man, that was a lot. I want to do that again.
Yeah.
It's a roller coaster.
A lot, but I'm going to take a nap and then I'll do it again.
But you segue nicely to the next cube to talk about. Want to talk about 100 Ornithopters?
I love talking about that cube. I'm on the tail end of my like frenetic design era with that cube.
I love this cube so much. I've had the pleasure of playing it twice. You have banned me from the cube on podcast.
I told you last night you're unbanned.
I know, I'm unbanned. I do really want to play it again.
Officially on record now, unbanned.
And this actually will be a story.
Should we explain what the 100 Ornithopters cube is?
Every episode is someone's first episode. This is my cube where the only creatures are 100 copies of the card Ornithopter. There are no other ways to win the game. There are no other ways to put a creature in play. No creature tokens, no creature lands.
There's no lightning bolt you can point in your opponent's face.
There's no face burn unless it involves sacrificing Ornithopters or something else to do with Ornithopters. It started as a joke. It turned out to be way more interesting and deep than I expected it to be. And yeah, it's the cube I've by far spent the most time in the last year working on. It's basically exactly a year old, I would say, too, as of the recording of this episode.
Happy birthday.
Yeah.
You skipped this, but I think there are two absolutely brilliant innovations that are integral to the success and functionality of the cube. The first is you have customized all 100 Ornithopters just by putting a number next to their names. So
yeah, I'm actually getting Eric
unique.
Klug to alter all of them. I'm only 1 out of 100 done, but I'm working on it.
Well, there's two forms of alteration. Technically, there's 3. But the first one that I think is huge is each Ornithopter has something that makes it unique.
Yep.
And that, what was it? I think Anthony said this off pod of like, that cube kind of proves that everybody has some form of numerology. Everybody has
No.
He's going to get so mad. Anthony would never say such a thing.
No, that was Andy.
I said that. Anthony said that it proves people have aesthetics around numbers that matter to them in some way.
I agree with both of you. I've simply misattributed a quote.
Hilariously, I might add.
It's okay. We're fungible.
Anthony really likes...
Don't wind him up in that way.
Please bleep that.
That if we ever have, a Patreon or a bonus feed, like that's what that feed will be for. Just winding up Anthony and letting him go on a big rant, but not right now.
So every Ornithopter is numbered, which creates these decisions where people get to pick Ornithopters that they love the numbers of over each other. I've had the experience in both of my drafts where I picked an Ornithopter with a number that I cared about over a non-Ornithopter card, just because I really wanted that Ornithopter. The second innovation that I think is absolutely brilliant is whoever gets to go 3-0 gets to customize their Ornithopter permanently. You give it a name, you can draw on it, and it creates this secondary goal that is connected to winning but still distinct from it. It gives you this feeling of contributing to history, getting to be part of a moment, personalizing the experience, which is brilliant and beautiful and had me giddy watching the CubeCon 2024 stream of seeing one of my Ornithopters getting played by somebody else, but it was mine.
And will always be yours. You named the
What
Ornithopter number 1.
I have number 1 and number 18.
Yeah.
Would you describe the Ornithopters?
Ornithopter number 18. Well, this is the story of the first draft. I can talk about both of these. The first time I drafted it, I think I don't know if it's a year old. I thought I contributed to one of the first drafts that happened when I was in town, I think late this spring, early this summer.
Yeah, well, so I would say the cube design is like a year old. Me building it in paper, I didn't build it in paper until early this year. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So this was probably the most anxious I've been about a draft in a very, very long time.
Which I was very surprised to hear.
It felt so different from everything that I played. I really wasn't sure if I was going to have fun. I wasn't sure if I was going to figure it out. I had such a hard time building my deck. I didn't know I think I had something like 13 or 14 Ornithopters, and I didn't know what the right number of lands was, whether I should play all of my Ornithopters. I lost my first game, and I was like, I don't think I'm getting this. I added a couple lands. Spoilers, the 2 times I played this, I ran a 42 card special because I couldn't figure out the math.
42?
I ran 42 cards.
Do you remember like roughly how many lands you started with and landed on?
I think it was something like I started with 12 and I went up to 14. And for both of these decks, the plan was basically draw the deck, so there wasn't actually as big of a cost. And then I figured out what my deck was doing and I just started winning. What I love about the environment, besides the design decisions, there's a lot to talk about, and I think there are great design lessons from all of these cubes. 100 Ornithopters is doing a couple really unique things that I haven't seen elsewhere, and I think it is young enough that we haven't yet seen the second generation of cubes that are inspired by it, whereas Turbo Cube, Reading Rainbow, we've been seeing a lot of those.
There are so many cool cubes out there people have been sharing with me that are still in their infancy that are like, oh, you can break Singleton this aggressively for like one card that you like a whole bunch, and there's 100 Memnites, there's 100 Basking Rootwallas, there's 100 Universal Automatons, there's multiple 100 Memnites, there's even 100 Deathrite Shamans, which which that one sounds particularly intense to me just because of the tension of you and your opponent both having a Deathrite Shaman leading to a
And
game of chicken.
You have a conversation about what's a mana ability before every draft.
The what's a mana ability cube. So I am thrilled to see all these like fun riffs on this, and can't wait to see where we are 2 years from now with the ones that have stuck and proved to be actually also interesting and viable and worth returning to themselves.
But I want to be clear, I'm about to talk more about the design of this, but I do feel like the thing that for me at least ties the room together is that sense of being part of history, the ability to personalize, the fact that each game piece, even though there are 100 copies of it, nevertheless feels unique and gives you opportunities to emotionally connect with every single one of the Ornithopters. And I want to see cubes that are playing in that space that are trying something different. Maybe there's nothing down that frontier, but that's the thing that's inspired my tokens cube, which hopefully I will have built and we get to talk about early next year.
I can't wait to play that one. I should say, I was actually reflecting the other day on the fact that for the longest time, I had the Bun Magic Cube, I had the Degenerate Micro Cube, I had some other like cube projects I was working on, but I never ever connected with the like card altering people. Like I was just like, there's some people that love getting their cube altered. They want to get like artist proofs of all these cards, and it just wasn't for me. I didn't like quite understand it, and I would have told you, I'll never alter a card. Like why would I ever alter a card? And then along comes Thunder Ornithopters, and I'm like, not only am I going to alter these cards, but it is like foundational to, I think, the like cohesive package of this cube. Like it is. I actually originally did it largely because I was like, well, I want people to be able to refer to a game piece and play without having to necessarily point to it. Like I think it's nice to have, I'll kill Ornithopter 4 or I'll block Ornithopter 6 with this. And then the idea that also if you're making a pick, actually still having a choice to make when you're taking an Ornithopter is so much more interesting than just being like, well, I'm taking one of these, doesn't matter. To be like, all right, I get to choose now. Like you described taking Ornithopter over a card you otherwise would have taken because the number was so interesting, and that's a different thing. But once you've committed to taking Ornithopter in a pack, now you get to pick. Like, all right, do I want a low number, a high number, a prime number, or whatever? And like,
just do I want this cool alter, or do I want to make sure I have a blank one? So if I win, I get to alter one.
Just giving people these like superficial choices is very fun. And so it's funny that like I would have never thought I'd be a card altering person, and then now it's like absolutely foundational to this cube.
I want to stress this. Both cubes, I saw a card, said, I want to personalize that, and I took it over every other thing in the pack. First draft, it was Ornithopter number 18, which is my favorite number. And second draft, I saw Ornithopter number 1. I'm like, I want to do it. I want to sign number 1.
Now that I'm more confident that I understand what this environment is, I'm going to headhunt Ornithopter number 1.
And the first draft, we had a lot of conversations about aura shards, about whether it's too strong or not.
Those conversations continue to this day.
I have softened on that, in that, I don't know, I'm going to tell you what my theories about 100 Ornithopters are.
Great.
I believe that 100 Ornithopters is a plus B sort of synergy engine cube, where every deck has a different kind of engine or different engines that it is going to run, but the fuel that every single deck runs on are Ornithopters. It could be that they're creatures, it could be that they're artifacts, it could be they cost 0 mana, but it is this beautiful unifying factor that reduces the complexity of the format because everyone knows what the fuel for every deck is going to be.
Yeah.
The sequencing of the cube I find really, really interesting because some decks want to deploy 1 or 2 Ornithopters early on. If you're an aggro deck with a single piece of equipment, you play 1 Ornithopter and you don't expose multiple Ornithopters to removal. If you have military intelligence, which
play
is
2.
You want to play 2 on turn 1 just in case you draw it. If you have a Glimpse of Nature or the Midnight Hunt version, Rite of Harmony, you want to hold every single one as long as you can.
Unless you have Retractor Hurkyl's Recall in hand, in which case you can do both. You can play them out and know that if you draw that card, you can always recall them and then still get all those triggers.
But I would still say for most environment, I'd say most decks, unless you're a full-on aggro deck, you probably want to hold Ornithopters in your hand as long as you possibly can because you expose yourself to things like Echoing Ruin, which will just, finally we're going to have a long card section this time. But there's a lot of cards that'll just blow up everything that you've built.
And it's funny, this was actually the very first draft of this cube I was not involved in. It was a list I had made as a joke to make somebody laugh on Twitter and maybe show them that their silly idea actually had legs. Then the CubeCon Discord decided to draft it, and the biggest piece of feedback I got from people was like, I didn't play my Ornithopters till I needed to, which was sometimes till turn 3 or 4, and it was like a much slower build-up than everyone thought it would be. They'd be like, everyone's creatures are free. It's going to be like the boards are just full from turn 1. But no, they're free, so you don't play them until you are going to use them that turn.
And this leads to some of my theories about the cube. My belief is that a combo control deck is the best thing that you can do. Card draw is the most powerful thing that you have access to, especially because the design conceit of the cube is Ornithopters are the fuel for every engine. So there's no ways to sort of filter, or last I played, there weren't ways to filter through your deck gently with ponders and preordains.
Yeah.
No, it's just like you have no card draw and you're drawing one card per turn, or you have Glimpse of Nature and you can draw your entire deck in one turn with almost nothing in between.
I have very consciously limited the card advantage specifically to requiring Ornithopters, basically. There are very few exceptions, like Thoughtcast, you can cast for 5 mana, or you can have other non-Ornithopter artifacts that are making it cheaper, but it's way better with Ornithopters. I do have Wheel of Fortune in there, which, obviously you draw 7 cards no matter what, but in order to get max value out of it, you want to be deploying all those Ornithopters from your hand. I'm actually curious, and I'll let you finish, we'll come back to this, but a card I added recently that I'm wary of is I added Viridian Revel, which says whenever an artifact is put into an opponent's graveyard from play, you may draw a card, which does not rely on you having Ornithopters at all, right? It actually rewards you just for having disenchants and killing your opponent's stuff. And I'm wary of that for that exact reason, that it could theoretically enable a deck that doesn't actually care about Ornithopters because all it's going to do is draw its deck with all of its other cards. Because the other engine that doesn't care about Ornithopters is Enchantress's Presence. And Bones, shout out to Bones, who we talk about all the time in this show, he believes the best deck in this cube by far is what he calls the Disenchantress deck, which is just disenchants and specifically Enchantress's Presence, because you need some way to draw cards if you're only casting disenchants. And he's had a lot of success with that deck in his own drafts. So anyway.
But how do you win?
You win, however. Like, he has one copy of... a lot of these decks, there's a lot of cards that win the game self-contained, right? You have one copy of Biomass Mutation, you have one copy of Scale Up, and the idea is that either you're going to draw your entire deck and control your opponent like you're describing, or like Bones is describing, you're going to just control your entire opponent, and then you'll draw that eventually. Like, card advantage is very slow and incremental in that kind of deck, but the point is that you only play as many Ornithopters as you need to fill out your deck, and if you have the 6 in play or the 7 in play, that's enough to kill your opponent with a Scale Up.
Yeah, it depends on what your engine is. My decks have generally involved Glimpse of Nature style combo decks where Ornithopters at a high density are essential fuel. The final, I think, decision point I've made, and I know this surprised you when I brought it up to you, because I believe so many games are slow, that it's really about A plus B, about finding ways to win the game, about ways to draw, and it's about drawing the right cards, and so many draws in your deck are either Ornithopter or land. There's this slow buildup, and you're often not under pressure, and I've chosen to be on the draw every single game that I've ever had the option to.
Which, to be fair, you win a lot, so it's not that often. You've been on the draw a lot, usually not because you got to choose it. I'm not giving you a general compliment about your play skill. I'm saying you objectively have won most of the games you've played of 100 Ornithopters. You don't get to choose very often.
Fair. I mean, I've had a fair share of 2-1.
When you say game, like you win the die roll, you say, I'm going to be on the draw. What do your opponents do for game 2?
That is a great question. I feel like the ones who've stopped and thought about it have chosen to be on the draw, and the ones who follow established heuristics choose to be on the play. But I think the heuristics are just different in 100 Ornithopters, especially because the aggro decks so often are about making one Ornithopter big, and there aren't that many ways to go super duper wide or super duper tall and not stop it with, I'm going to cash in my Ornithopter and gain 4 to 8 life just by chump blocking, which I think inherently reduces the efficacy of aggro.
Person who's only had success with aggro in the 100 Ornithopters cube.
I'm just thinking about that question.
Tear him
because
down.
I know that both players cannot be right. If you say I want to be on the draw and I say I want to be on the play, one of us is wrong.
But also you can never know.
And I still would just want to be on the play, but I don't want to say that you're wrong because that seems wrong.
I mean, it's funny. You've both had success with very different decks in this cube.
But they both play Glimpse of Nature.
Well, that's the thing. Is I would say, like,
I think it's just, but also Glimpse of Nature, I believe, is the best card in the cube.
It's definitely up there. It's really, really messed up.
I think it's stronger than Echoing Boon.
I love hearing that. I hope you're right.
I mean, I think Echoing Boon is probably still like number 2. But also,
where do you rank like Cradle and Academy up there?
Very, very high, but those are more interchangeable effects.
There's 2 of them instead of 1 of them, but there's Rite of Harmony too.
No, but there's also budget versions of those. There's Rite of Harmony,
Three Tree City.
There's 3 Tree City. I think there's at least one more. But all that's to say, cards I feel like is the most important resource in 100 Ornithopters, which is also a breath of fresh air of like, if you go back I don't know, Cube in 2012, often a lot of games were decided by card advantage. Contemporary cubes, creatures are just better. Threats are just better. Curves are just lower. And people are mindfully designing their cubes in a way that oftentimes it's less about card advantage and more about board presence. And it feels beautifully nostalgic, which may or may not be a segue, to have this format where I played Magic in 2011. Sometimes good players chose to be on the draw, and at least it was a discussion about whether or not they were right. 100 Ornithopters brings back a lot of those classic play heuristics that I haven't seen in a long time.
That is hilarious and amazing.
I don't know if you're right, but I do definitely feel that the play draw matters so much less in that cube than I have felt it matters in a lot of other cubes, because if you have your engine, you have your engine, and if you don't, you don't. But I will say that the most recent match I played at this cube with Anthony, I had...
This was a crazy game. I was actually telling Zach about this morning.
Yeah, I had I would say a combo control deck. My control element was mostly that I had a fair number of disenchants, and I did have aura shards with ways to find it, and I had multiple ways to pick up all my Ornithopters, Hercule's Recall style effects. And in one game against Anthony, who was playing a red-green aggro deck, certainly not without card advantage. This is what I'll say about you, is that you're playing an aggro deck, but you don't underestimate the value of just drawing cards.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I had Glimpse of Nature and Rite of Harmony.
And Galvanic Relay.
And Galvanic Relay. You want to call
and Showdown of the
Vandal
Skulls.
Blast? Yes, okay. So I like to draw cards.
I mean, those were your only sources of card advantage, I believe, those 4 cards. And most of your other cards just said, make Ornithopter big so it can attack.
Correct.
Which you need both, right? Like, I think if a player that's like, aggro's no good because all I did was take, ways to make Ornithopters big and nothing else, and I lost. It's like, well, yeah, you also need to think about the fundamental things that matter here. And I agree, card advantage matters a ton in this cube. But we had a game where I don't remember the exact specifics of
Oh, I remember.
I mean, I know what happened and that I lost, but I don't remember quite how it worked out that way, because I drew and played Aura Shards. I played 4 Ornithopters, blowing up 2 of your enchantments that mattered, and 2 Ornithopters.
The thing about Aura Shards is when everything is an Ornithopter or an artifact or enchantment to make your Ornithopters bigger, Aura Shards is just your hand is full of 0 mana Vindicates.
Yeah, and then you played a couple more things, just forcing me to have answers, and so I cast Hercule's Recall and picked up all 4
No,
more
you cast
Ornithopters.
Paradoxical Outcomes, so not only
That's
were
even
you
better. That's true.
drawing
No, you're
4
right.
Vindicates, you also drew an additional 4 or 5 cards.
That's true. I cast Paradox Outcome, picked up all my Ornithopters, played them all in the game, blew up everything, and then I lost this game.
It was one of these games that I was like, I should scoop now. Like, there's no way.
You even said out loud, I should scoop now, and I was like, you're welcome to concede at any time.
But like, you hadn't presented a way to win the game was the thing. So I was
didn't
like,
draw my combo. It was
I
just
will
further down my deck. And
Tell us the story of your victory, Anthony.
I mean, I think that I won because I was a little bit patient, sandbagged my Ornithopters, and then eventually drew a Rite of Harmony. You countered it, I flashed it back, and had the 2 mana to pay for the Spell Pierce, and then drew 3 cards, and then the last 3 cards in my deck. You were at a very low life total at this point. Were, Fists of Flames and another way to put a counter on my Ornithopter, or remove one of your Ornithopter blockers, and that's how I won.
I just lost to Exaxes from Fists of Flame. I was at 3.
With me at, I think 2 or 3 cards left in library.
2 or 3 cards left in
and
library.
It was a hell of a game.
It wasn't even that long on the clock. Like, we were going pretty quickly and just both drawing a bunch of
There
cards.
was a lot of draw, go.
And I probably had 12 or 15 cards in my deck and just hadn't drawn my win condition yet, which, I don't know, taught me the value of maybe having more than one, because, I mean, my deck was solid. I think I 2-1'd that draft. But yeah, I was a control deck that had 1 win condition, and it was a very reliable win condition. I didn't draw it in time for you to draw the rest of your whole deck.
Not so reliable then, is it?
Fair. Anyway, I am reveling in the fact that I think we're still in the very early days of figuring out what matters in this format. I mean, I think we can all agree that card advantage matters. We can all agree that Glimpse of Nature is broken. That's fine. We got the pillars.
Do we have to tell everybody that?
I mean, people keep passing it. You got it passed to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. We agree on some like high level things, but should you be on the draw? How many win conditions do you need? How many lands do you need? Should you play more than 40 cards if you can reliably have a bunch of card draw engines? Like, I mean, part of my heuristics brain is like, that can't be right. Like, surely there should have been 2 cards you should have cut. But your card slots are fiercely constrained in this cube because you got to play enough lands to have lands in your opening hand. You got to play enough Ornithopters for all your engines to do anything. And then you only have so many slots left for like cards that matter. And if you can put a couple more cards that matter in your deck, that might be the difference.
And to be clear, I knew I was making a mistake playing more than 40 cards. I'm not going to pretend like, oh yeah, I was going to draw my whole deck with Glimpse of Nature and I had Demonic Tutor, so it was always going to happen, so I was right. No, I'm like, I I don't know. I'm just going to play all my Ornithopters, and I think I'm going to play enough lands that go with it. And I'm sorry.
I mean, but is it reasonable to say, I think the way that you think about things that comes through very clearly is you have questions, you create a hypothesis and figure out a way to answer those questions. And was just playing a 42 card deck suboptimal, but the best way to answer those questions that you had?
As in, did you know you were performing an experiment, but this experiment, despite being a suboptimal deck, would allow you to answer those questions more efficiently because you just had more of the questions in your deck.
I'm going to be humble. I'm not going to say, "Oh, I was being smart and thoughtful in this experiment." I'm going to say I was scared and I didn't know what the right answer is. And
I think both of
I did
these
it the
things can be
first time
true.
when I was like, I played 40. No, I should be playing 42. And the second time I'm like, I don't know. This is fun. I think I also drafted so many non-basics that
Your second draft especially, you were many non-basics.
Yeah, I did put 2 basics in, and that's what put the deck up to 42. And I just found that so funny that I did it. But I won't pretend like that was me being like, yes, I'm thinking really hard about it.
That's still one of my favorite decks anybody has drafted in this cube yet, because it was one of the decks that made me soften a lot more on the idea of like a 4 or 5 color pile in this format, because you drafted fixing really highly. You ignored pips pretty much entirely. You're like, I'll play any good card, whatever's passed to me. But the result was this very interesting Jeskai Ascendancy combo control deck that, from what I saw, mostly won by casting a huge Fists of Flame to having already, pumped your Ornithopters 12 times by drawing 12 cards with Jeskai Ascendancy. Then you also doubled their, power with the Fists of Flame and gave it trample. Cool.
I was going to say, Fists of Flame has one of the most important words in this cube on it, which is trample.
Very good word.
I would say it has the 3 most important words.
Draw a card.
Draw a trample.
Draw a trample. Draw a card, trample. The 3 most important words.
And after that, you're allowed to draw on a card.
But I think the cube is forgiving to pretty ambitious mana bases, in the sense that so many of your cards are colorless. So much of what the gameplay is about getting to the point that you can spend 4 mana on a single card. And I mean, also, I know you just had Jen on, and Jen is great, and we have very different aesthetics in this regard, because I accept the dangers of 5-color good stuff, and I also love 5-color good stuff. I try to make it hard to draft in my environments, but I will definitely do it if somebody lets me do it. And in 100 Ornithopters, you absolutely can do it, and I think you
You absolutely can do it. No one else has done it, but you can do it.
It's just about discipline. Like, eat your vegetables.
5-color good stuff is about discipline.
I think
you heard it here first.
Yeah.
I think card evaluation skills are essential to drafting that deck, especially in a cube like this. Like, knowing which of these synergy pieces you are likely to be able to actually reliably make good, or how many answers. Like, it was a beautiful cocktail of like the right amount of interaction, the right kind of interaction, the right amount of card advantage and card draw, and the right density of win conditions. It was like a symphony, a beautiful symphony, that deck. Which, I mean, I myself have tried to draft and fallen short. I've seen other people try and draft something similar and fall short. I think I told you last night that Jeskai Ascendancy and Song of Creation are the 2 cards that are most responsible for people train wrecking and then saying, like, I thought this card was good here, but it turns out it's just bad. And it's like, it turns out maybe you don't quite know how to play with it just yet.
I mean, Jeskai Ascendancy is missing a bunch of the cards that really make it function.
It doesn't work with Ornithopter. That doesn't trigger it.
Well, not only that, it's you don't have the cheap, low-impact cantrips that you can magnify the value of.
Right.
You can't just cast a Preordain, and the Preordain generates a small amount of incremental value that if you can get chain 4 spells off, you'll win with. There just aren't a lot of those cards in the cube because everything is built around Ornithopters. And Jeskai Ascendancy looked broken when I was winning the game with it, and 90% of the time it was the worst card in my hand, and my opponent had no idea.
I should say, too, actually, I would give credit to Daniel of Reading Rainbow. Did go 2-1 with, I think, a pretty similar deck. It was 4 colors, Jeskai Ascendancy, a card that I've added since you played, which is Proph's Eidetic Memory, which goes perfectly in that deck.
Yep.
And it was so cool to watch Daniel go off with those cards. So someone else has done it, I guess, though not quite to the degree of success, but
I want more people to have
in the
that
finals.
Fun experience.
Yeah, it's just such a cool deck.
So I was talking about classical gameplay patterns of how 100 Ornithopters is evocative of this older era where oftentimes people were going to be on the draw. You had these slower, like faster turns, but slower games because you hit more turns. Shall we talk about Neoclassical?
Let's do it.
I love this cube.
I do too.
This is, of all your cubes, the one I've played the most. We played this on the train ride up and down from Boston Cube Party.
It's got big play me on a train vibes.
Yes.
Don't drop a card, though.
That's okay. You can get beat up. It's fine.
Well, just don't lose it.
Yeah, don't lose it, but, you know.
And we were talking about this on the previous pod, but the aesthetics of the cube are so integral to the experience that you're not just playing with classic cards, you're playing with classic cards in a way that classic cards were played with. The fact that cards are damaged and unsleeved is so fun. And everybody, at least as far as I've played it, has sort of agreed to not use that information. Like, I think you've replaced it, but I had the most marked memory jar I've ever seen.
I have since replaced it because the whole corner fell off. So I think
once the corner falls off,
it crossed the threshold, and I had to get a slightly less worn memory jar.
And this one is harder because I can't point to one experience of like, this is the story of this happening. I just say, like, every time I see that cube, it makes me happy. I've heard cube designers lament about sort of the state of modern cube design, about everything from words on cards to the speed of gameplay. And what I always want to tell those people is, like, all those cards exist. You can always go back. There's nothing saying that you can't take a 6-year-old cube that you haven't updated and just play with it. And you might cringe and want to make some changes, and you might just enjoy the vibes of a previous time. Neoclassical, I walked out of the second CubeCon deeply inspired by Jabs' Modern Darlings, which like hit a perfect nostalgia point for me because I did play early Modern. I wonder if more people are going to make these nostalgic environments. Like, I want to go back to a time that I feel great about. I love how Neoclassical does that, and I love that I have gotten to play multiple cubes that are doing different stabs at that. There's Jeff Green's Old Border Foiled Cube, which is beautiful and so much fun to play with.
Direct inspiration for the Neoclassical Cube. It was my experience playing that at the first CubeCon that I was like, wait, this is way more different than I thought it would be.
And a recent addition, and a third thing that I would really love to play back-to-back with the Old Border Foil Cube Neoclassical. I was just at PAX Unplugged, and Dan Schneider built a Old Border Battle Box, which has a very, very different aesthetic, and we can have an entire teleological question about whether BattleBox is or is not cube, but all three of them are nostalgic experiences for a different era of Magic, and I love how all of them have really different play experiences. I would love to play each one of them back to back and then just like have a 2-hour-long conversation of like, what resonated with each of us? What do we like about all of these things?
I feel like I've learned a lot from that cube because, like I said, when I played the Ouroboros Foil Cube at the first CubeCon, I didn't anticipate that it would feel so much different from contemporary Magic, but it really did. It felt so much slower, not in the sense that like the games were longer or the turns took longer or anything, just like everything was, you knew that like there wasn't going to be this like crazy turn where like you had this little bit advantage, then your opponent just completely flipped it on its head and like completely turned things around in like no time. There was always these very like subtle back and forths, and the thing I ended up sort of latching onto that made the big difference was like, there are broken cards in Old Border Magic. The most broken cards of all time, arguably, were all printed in the earliest years of Magic because R&D was still finding its footing and didn't know where the limits were. So it's not that...
And also, nobody knew that the game was going to be anywhere near as successful as it was.
Yeah, Roger Garfield was like, well, somebody will have one Mox that they opened, and that's fine. They'll have just the one.
They're not going to be able to like,
get more.
Track down a bunch more. How would they do that?
Yeah, there's no economy to find such a thing. Anyway, I sort of latch onto the idea that like all of the power outliers, really, for the most part, in the early days of Magic, require you to like jump through some hoops to get benefit from them. There are very few that just like, I play this and I won the game because I played this card. And modern power outliers are kind of the opposite. Like, for a card to be good in like the modern era of Magic, it really has to carry a lot on its own. It's got to be just like pretty self-contained, pretty lunchable style that it just kind of does everything it needs to do. So even though I have like strayed from the explicit restriction of just Old Border cards in that cube, I'm sticking to that heuristic of like the power outliers have to be enablers, or have to be like things you have to enable. You need to like work to get value out of your busted old card. You can't just play, you know, a Planeswalker and just uptick it and start taking over the game, or play a big creature that just you can't answer it cleanly and just runs away with things.
Yeah, but the cube has that. It just has different feeling versions of it. Like Arcanus the Omnipotent and Symbiotic Worm are examples of cards that Arcanus unanswered, I mean, you're going to win the game. It's a lot like upticking a Planeswalker.
But it's so much easier to answer.
Yes, But I'm making a minor disagreement with you here. I think those kinds of experiences that we have in modern Cube, in modern card design, still exist in Neoclassical Cube.
Well, yeah, it's all relative.
But there are meaningful textural differences of them, and the feeling of like Jace the Mind Sculptor upticking is very different than the feel of Arcanus the Omnipotent upticking. Jace starts working immediately. Arcanus, you need it to survive.
Yeah, you either got a turn or you had to wait until your opponent had 10 mana to actually protect it. Like, you've got a window to deal with it.
And Symbiotic Worm and Spiritmonger are giant, unanswerable threats for entire kinds of decks, unless they have very specific kinds of tools for them. But they're slower. They're more expensive. They are more vulnerable than comparable kinds of things that you're going to see. And the overall dynamic of the experience, I think, still feels familiar to a modern player. But the textural elements and the temporal ones of on what turns are these things happening are different. And that's part of the joy.
One of the big differences about this cube for me and my approach is that it's really the first cube where I put vibes forward above any kind of semblance of balance, or, you know, there's cards of wildly different power levels in that cube because this is the old border cube where I want to play them. Like, this is the experience is about this like nostalgic experience. So yeah, you get Library of Alexandria, that's pretty cracked. And also you play that alongside Basking Root Walla or like some like completely forgettable creature or threat.
Classic combo. Library of Alexandria, draw, discard to hand size, Basking Root Walla, get priority during my cleanup step.
Yeah, I'm playing Whip Quarter here alongside Demonic Tutor, Time Spiral, you know, stuff that is just...
You remembered the forgettable creature. Great job.
I don't get it. What's the reference I'm missing?
You just said some forgettable creature and then struggled to name a creature.
Oh, I see. It's good. I like it. Anyway, was really my first, like, I'm going to just let go of trying to, like, maintain a relatively narrow power band, which is something I felt... It permeates so much of cube design. We've talked on previous episodes with you about how that idea of balance is maybe fraught at best, but it was the first cube where I was just like, I'm not worried about that at all. Like, if it comes down to it, if a card proves to be unfun because of the power level disparity, then I'll consider cutting it, but it has to prove to be unfun first before I care about the power level disparity, which has been very freeing, and it's, I think, closer to how I actually approach every other cube design now. I'm just like, I care about what's fun.
Which is great. It means you are relying on other people and playtesting to determine, all right, like, what looks like it's good? What is making people feel miserable or hopeless? That's going to be such a better teacher for you of what the cube should contain than theory crafting, especially if you were designing for an as-played experience rather than, I don't know, like the Ferrari you keep in the garage and rarely drive but enjoy tuning up, which is an absolutely valid approach to cube, but is less likely to lead you to the kinds of experiences that are designed for other people.
I think it also is a testament to what we say so much of this show, which is that so much of people's perception is shaped by their expectations. And that is a cube where I'm like, look, it's old border. The threats are kind of junky by modern standards, but there's also some incredibly broken stuff you can do, and you should be prepared for Winter Orbs and Tangle Wires and people looping Parallax Wave with Auramancer and, you know, people going off with Mind Over Matter. Like, be prepared for some nonsense in the context of the kind of magic that used to be much more prevalent than it is now, right? Like, be prepared to die to a fireball cast for 20. Like, that happens a lot in that cube, and that is not a thing that we would see in modern Magic for a variety of reasons. Only one kind of deck can interact with that, and if you can't interact with it, it's not that fun, but that's what the environment is about.
Mm-hmm. And I love
you get to play a Beta Fireball, which are surprisingly, I mean, I thought it'd be a lot more expensive. Beta Fireball, not that bad.
And it just feels good to riffle shuffle cards.
It feels so good. So good. I was really overwhelmed and surprised by how good it felt to riffle shuffle cards. I don't want to be too ambitious about like what this decision is about, but to me it really is kind of a statement of like not caring about so many aspects of the game that I don't value. Like, I don't want to care about these as commodities. I don't want these to be commodities. I just want them to be game pieces. And I love just making it about the game pieces and not about any of the other aspects of the game that are so often conflated. Were you intentionally, are you just like the best podcaster alive, or are you intentionally planning all these sort of segues? Because you started mentioning playtesting, which I think is the next thing we're going to talk about on a future episode. Is that how you intentionally wrap things up, or does that just come naturally to you?
I don't know. This is how my mind works. It's a combination
Get up on that mic.
Yeah, are you...
I don't know. It's like I came prepared with a bunch of notes and different ideas just so I didn't end up rambling. But my background's in improv theater, so I don't know. Like, trying to set things up.
Trying to connect things together.
I like to
pull
bump
those
a ball
threads.
so that somebody else can spike it.
There you go. Well, I think on that bombshell, we're going to close the book on this episode of Lucky Paper Radio, The Barash Files. We have more coming in the future, and we're going to talk about playtesting. And I'm not sure the schedule on which these will come out, but whenever you're listening to this, at some point in the future, there will be an episode where we're talking to Zach about playtesting and how to turn that playtesting feedback into useful design direction.
I look forward to finding out what the heck we're going to say when we say it.
That's how I always feel when I turn these microphones on. Can't wait to hear what comes out of my mouth. That'll be fun discovery process. That's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and speaking to microphones about it. If we got any of the card text wrong, that was intentional to bait engagement, so don't fall for it. Zach and Anthony, thank you for the gift of podcast.
Thank you for the gift of friendship.
Thank you for the gift of snacks.
Fine.
Thank you for the gift of Cube.
Yeah,
Thank you
there
for the
go.
gift of Cube.
Close on it hard.
No one. I'm not going to get a single barbershop out of you guys.
Give me the cube again.
No, we ruined it. We'll try it next episode.
Like a barbershop quartet?
Like a barbershop. Well, we need Sadie for the barbershop.
I cannot participate in this.
No?
The
You don't
listeners will
sing?
not approve.
I don't
No.
know that I'll be able to harmonize. I'll definitely be able to hit the same note a whole octave up.
You just have to hit a note, and you can go second.
I can definitely do a note. Cube.
And you go, Cube.
Cube.
Yeah, Cube.